Okay, thanks, Milton. I'm David Canning for the Madison area MPO, and the MPO's had a subscription to StreetLight for about the past year, and we've used it pretty extensively over that period. Next slide. So this slide here shows some of the ways in which we've used StreetLight data. So we've got about 6 use cases that we'll go over. So I'll start off by talking about how we've evaluated the accuracy of StreetLight daily volume estimates. Next, I'll talk about how we're using StreetLight data to validate and calibrate our travel demand model, which we're currently updating. Next, I'll talk briefly about how we're using StreetLight to calculate VMT, which is something which we're just starting to do. And lastly, I'll say a few words about the StreetLight segment analysis tool that Colleen Hosley from the MPO has been using recently. Then Ben will talk about the EJ analysis that he's been working on. And lastly, he'll describe the results of a bicycle origin destination analysis that Bill Holloway from the MPO has been working on. Next. So in use case number 1, we compared daily traffic counts with StreetLight daily volume estimates. Next. The importance of having accurate data for various different planning purposes is basically the point I was trying to make. What we did is compared, WISDOT counts and Madison counts with the data from StreetLight. Next. So this is a regression analysis that I ran, and along the x-axis are WISDOT traffic counts, annual average daily traffic counts from 2018, and along the y-axis are StreetLight volume estimates from 2018. And the results show that the StreetLight data is very reliable. The R-squared value of 0.983 shows a really strong correlation between the two. Also, we were impressed by the mean absolute percentage error for each of the volume categories you can see. So for streets with less than 15,000, for instance, the MAPE was about 8%, and from 15 to 30,000, 9%, and so on. So it was another good way of measuring the accuracy of the data. Next. Did the same kind of analysis with data from the city of Madison. So we took City of Madison average weekday traffic volumes from 2017 and compared them to StreetLight volumes from the same year. You got an even better R-squared value, 0.990. So that really exceeded our expectations. And again, the mean absolute percentage error numbers that you can see are also fall within the ranges. Next. Lastly, we compared short-term counts, which are 48-hour counts for the city of Madison, with StreetLight daily volumes, and we got what we expected, an R-squared value that was a bit lower because it's not really an apples-to-apples comparison, but this did give us a lot of confidence in the data for all of those count sites, and then also for streets where we don't have available accounts. Next. So use case number 2 is using StreetLight data for travel demand model calibration and validation. Next. So one of the ways in which we use StreetLight data was to perform an external, internal EI and IE analysis in order to see the percentage of vehicles that just simply travel through Dane County without ever stopping in Dane County. Those are EE trips that start in Dane County and end in Dane County. Those are II trips. And then EI trips and IE trips, as you can see in the image below. Next. So this is important when it comes to travel demand model calibration. As I mentioned kind of at the beginning, we are in the process of updating our travel model, and we really didn't have a good data set for the results that we're getting here. And so StreetLight was able to provide that. And the results show that about 86% of trips start in Dane County and end in Dane County. Those are II trips. About 2.5% of trips are external trips, and the rest are internal and external trips. Those are about 5.6% and 5.86%. So very good data for our consultant who's currently working on updating our travel model in terms of calibrating it. Next. We're also able to use StreetLight data for travel demand model validation purposes. So in this scenario, what we did was create about 100 different planning districts in Dane County and ran an origin destination analysis in order to get trip tables. And this is going to prove useful when it comes time to validating the trip tables in the travel model when we get to that point. And we'll be able to validate that against the travel survey data later this fall. Next. So use case number 3 is VMT. Next. So we're just starting to use this feature of StreetLight. Many of you have probably heard of SV 743 out of California, which places a huge emphasis on VMT. VMT is something that we think should be emphasized as well in Dane County. It's definitely needed when looking at the goals of the Dane County Climate Action Plan. And it's also needed for good sustainable land use and transportation planning, and that it's a good sustainable practice to try to steer new developments in areas with lower VMT. So on this slide, you're seeing census tracts in Dane County, and areas in red would be those tracts where the average VMT per household is higher, or the VMT per household is higher than the average for the county, and the green would be where it's lower. So it does make a lot of sense that the areas that are more central would have, the lower VMTs, and the areas in the outer area would have higher VMTs. There are a couple red tracks kind of within the green areas, but those just barely went over the 69.68 threshold. Next. Use case number 4 is a segment analysis tool that Colleen has worked on quite a bit. So before getting to that, should talk about the Vision Zero initiative in Madison. Madison is endorsing that. The policy is to eliminate fatalities and serious injuries that are a result of crashes on streets and paths by 2030. So speed limit reduction is one of the principal components of that initiative. Next. So one corridor that's being investigated is the East Washington corridor. City staff wanted to see if reducing posted speeds, which are currently 35 miles per hour, would affect peak period congestion. And this map shows that the average speed for the AM peak periods are all between 21 and 26 miles per hour. And that AM peak period is between the hours of 6 and 9 a.m. So this is probably not a good candidate for reducing speeds, as the speeds are already quite low, especially during the peak periods. We can also see the distribution of speeds for any length that we want. So that's also something that we're interested in and seeing for corridor type analyses. There are a couple of limitations with this data set though. One being that the data isn't quite as granular as we would hope for. We can get down to the 1 hour time period, but can't get down to say the 30-minute or even 15. That might be asking a lot for this type of data, but perhaps that will be available in the future. Also, these speeds do take into effect the traffic signal delay. So that's another reason why they might be where they're at. Next. So this slide provides an overview of the congestion management process, and it's basically an approach to reducing congestion and maximizing safety and mobility. Next. So this slide shows the relative level of congestion in the Park Street corridor. It's really just an example of how we can perhaps use StreetLight data for our congestion management process. And just a couple things to note about this. You can see in the bottom the different congestion scales. So the red would be the most congested, 46 to 58% of the time it's congested. And then the green would be the least congested. So definitely most congested along the northern area of the Park Street corridor, and then not quite as congested south of that. So you can see relative congestion. StreetLight does give us things like average speed, free flow factor, and congestion, and we can calculate free flow speed from average speed and free flow factor. But it's worth noting that when it comes to these types of metrics, what's the best type to report to the general public? So really, I think one metric would be just total travel time in the corridor. Driving the entire corridor during perhaps an AM peak period or PM peak period. seeing what that is, and then comparing that to what the travel time in the corridor would be outside of the peak periods. That's something that StreetLight can provide for us, although it's not shown on the slide. So we also want to look at travel time reliability, and that requires percentile speeds in order to calculate that. So we would need the 50th percentile, 85th percentile, and 95th percentile speeds in order to calculate that. That's not something that StreetLight currently does provide, but so that's something we'll have to look to in the future when we get further along in the process. So that's the conclusion of the slides that I'm going to present. Ben will now talk about the EJ analysis he's worked on, and also some bike OD analyses that Bill Holloway has spent some time on.
Hey, David, quickly before you run, you got a question here. Actually, two questions, if you wouldn't mind answering. The first question is, during your comparison, were any volume comparisons made for shorter time periods, less than 24-hour volumes, such as 4 hours or 1 hour, for example?
We have done some comparisons for that. Most recently, WISDOT worked on a forecast for the County Trunk Highway AB area, along with US Highway 1218, since the new interchange is being done there. And so we did look at that. The point here is that, for general planning purposes, the kind of work that we do, we're most interested in daily volumes, but certainly comparisons should be done for shorter time intervals as well. And we've looked at that. I can't really provide any further examples of that at this time, but we haven't been disappointed with the data when looking at that. I do remember that it did make sense.
Sure, great. And then one more question, kind of to coattail on that is, do you see StreetLight traffic volume estimates taking the place of short-term actual counts in the future?
So the way I would answer that is the MPO doesn't take counts, but we have had discussions with City Madison transportation staff about using StreetLight estimates to reduce the frequency of counts on the lower volume streets and even the medium volume streets. And this would allow resources to be used for other counts, maybe bike counts and other types of things. So the turning movement counts have been pretty useful, and they are pretty time intensive otherwise to take. So that's been one of the benefits of the StreetLight subscription, is getting those turning movement counts. And also, as I mentioned kind of just previously, the hourly distribution data has been used to factor up hourly counts, and that's the example that I just gave with the WISDOT traffic forecast at County Trunk Highway AB and US Highway 1218.
Great. Thanks, David. And now we can pass it over to Ben.
Excellent, thank you. I'm working on several different projects, primarily related to transit planning, which I'm going to get back to a little bit later here. But for those efforts, and then also just for our general Title VI and environmental justice review to include in our long-range transportation plan and our transportation improvement program, we wanted to come up with a set of zones that are fairly standardized and justifiable for our environmental justice areas, concentrations of persons of color and minorities and lower income. So I've been running a bunch of different analyses with those zone sets, and you can go to the next slide, please, Milton. So we did this for several different reasons. One, we want to better understand the journey to work and other travel by people who reside in those environmental justice priority areas. And we want to do that in order to identify how we can improve the transportation system to benefit the residents of those priority areas. Next slide, please. So we've had a few different examples here, and I've run a whole bunch of these analyses, way more than we wanted to submit everyone to in this presentation. So I've just got cherry-picked a few to look at here. One priority or one challenge is to identify the current work locations for residents of environmental justice priority areas. We know that people of color have a much longer trip to work and often have to, if they're riding transit, transfer at much higher rates between buses than our white neighbors do. And so really wanted to understand, where are these people going currently, where are they coming from, where are they going currently, so that we can use that data to try and improve their options for making those trips. One of the things that we found in looking at all of these various environmental justice areas that we mapped out, when we compared them to our concentrated employment centers, where there are not just jobs spread out through a neighborhood, but really, employment centers with a lot of jobs in a small area that could easily be served by just a couple transit stops. And what we found is that most of the top employment center destinations from each of those different environmental justice areas are, generally speaking, very close, within 4 miles of each environmental justice area. And there's an animation, so go ahead and click there again. And you can see the employment centers are shown in the graph on the bottom right. And then I circled in red the zones that are in the red oval on the map. And that little black area is the environmental justice priority area, the residential area. And then the heat map is showing from red being the biggest destination down to cooler colors being less popular destinations. And as you can see, the vast bulk of trips that are coming out of that neighborhood are really not going terribly far. And so we can use this to try and facilitate those trips. Next slide, please. And go ahead and click it again. And so again, I've got basically a 4-mile radius around the clustered environmental justice priority areas. So once I looked at each environmental justice area individually, I started to cluster them together so that single neighborhoods could be considered, and we could look at how that functions. We then also added in, on top of the employment centers, the transportation analysis zone supergroups or superblocks that were sort of cookie cut left over from those employment centers to cover the rest of Dane County. And what we found was that even when we do it that way, the top employment centers are still very close, relatively speaking, to those clustered environmental justice areas. However, the bulk of the jobs are not in the employment centers. They're actually spread out in more dispersed areas, which unfortunately makes it a lot harder to serve with transit. But at least, they are, generally speaking, still shorter trips. Next slide, please. And so here, I wanted to look at what, again, the current work locations for residents of those environmental justice priority areas were. Previously, I was looking at all-day data. And here I wanted to look at off-peak data, especially when buses are not running. A lot of lower wage jobs are not your traditional peak hour commute jobs. People who are cleaning things overnight, stocking shelves, getting things ready for business during the day. And so lo and behold, we saw a very different behavior here in terms of travel patterns, where, go ahead and click again. I think we've got some red circles coming up. Oh, no, sorry, go back. Put those red circles on almost every map. But as you can see from the black origin home location, rather than being clustered right near that area as the all-day data was, instead a lot of folks are going up to the Middleton Business Park, which is a much farther distance, about double the trip of the distance of the bulk of people who are traveling during the all-day period. So this poses a whole different set of opportunities and challenges. Then looking at that and saying, well, if there are all these people who are coming from Southwest Madison going up to Middleton Business Park between midnight and 6 a.m., where else are these people coming from? And so I ran another analysis, the bottom right labeled 2, where I looked at the destination of the Middleton Business Park and then said, okay, well, which environmental justice priority areas are sending workers to this area during that midnight to 6 a.m. period? And we see here that it's much more spread out. And again, a lot harder to serve with transit or even with van pools. You can start to imagine that if we could have an employer group in the Middleton Business Park start some sort of shared van pool to get people there for off-peak shifts. That perhaps one van could start in Sun Prairie and swing through North Madison, and another could start down in the southeast part of Madison or South Madison, and then follow essentially along the Beltline a little bit south of it and pick people up to get up to the Middleton Business Park. And so starting to look at the data in different ways and for different purposes, and hoping that we can also use this for travel demand management and helping employers get workforce to their door for off shift peaks, or off peak shifts, sorry. Next slide. And then finally, I think one of the important things that's really great about StreetLight is it allows you very easily to set up and run analyses, and sometimes what you get back is not very interesting, and it tells you that you don't really need to spend any more time there. It could have taken a lot of time to collect this information via any other means, but looked at the individual environmental justice priority areas, those residential areas, and looked at the gateways to and from Dane County to see how many people were leaving the county for work, or if there were any larger employers that were outside the county that were pulling a lot of people. And as you can see from the numbers in the chart in the bottom right, the volumes are quite small, not really something that we can do much to serve with transit or that could justify employer van pools. But again, it was very easy. It took me about, well, David set up the gates for me, and then he ran the analysis, and that generally takes 10-15 minutes to set up. And then the next day we had the data and we're able to look at it. So really very easy labor and a great return, and that we now know that this is not a tree we want to bark up anymore. Next slide, please. And so now I'm going to move on to the bicycle origin destination analysis that Bill Holloway has been working on. We're working to improve the understanding of bicycle travel behavior in Dane County. We're rated as a very good place to ride a bike by many different organizations that do such things, but it can be difficult to know where and how far people are riding. Unfortunately, we are not able to calibrate the StreetLight index values currently because of problems with our own available 2018 bike count data. So we can kind of do, we can look at the data proportionally, and we're looking forward to next year when we have better data from the city that we can match up and do. We can then do the calibration between the 2019 StreetLight data, which you don't have quite the whole year for yet, against the available counts for 2019. We hope to move forward with that soon. Next slide, please. So just some examples of the insights on what we can get from big data for bicycle trips. The graphics on the right, not the photos, but the little charts are built-in visualizations in StreetLight. And so we can look at the duration, the length and time of trips, and the proportional number of trips at each of those durations, and then also the distance. And so again, we can't tell the number of trips because we haven't been able to do the calibration, but we can look at the percentage of trips, and we can see that, as would be expected, basically 50% of bicycle trips in Dane County are 10 minutes or less, 75% are 15 minutes or less, which backs up the information that bicycles are quite often used for very short errands and doesn't have to be an ordeal or a long trek. Then also the distance of the trip, where over 50% of the trips are less than a mile in length, and I think it's 80% is less than 2 miles. So that really does help us just in terms of understanding the network and how people use that. The median length of a trip is less than 1 mile, and the average is just 2.8 miles. And this is actually quite similar to our 2017 household travel survey, which had a median of 1.2 miles and an average of 1.9 miles. So, we're pretty comfortable with this data. It definitely passes the red face test. And next slide, please. So, although we are county-wide, a great place to ride a bike, there is definitely a lot of a concentration of bike trips in terms of where those trips originate. The University of Wisconsin-Madison and that part of downtown and is definitely a hotspot. It accounts for nearly 20% of all originating bike trips. Unfortunately, the way that the data is then shown, it kind of hides what's going on in the smaller areas. And we can see a few other pockets near the East Town Mall, a few other neighborhoods where there's a little bit more ridership, but just the way that the graphics are set up in StreetLight, when you have such a large proportion of trips in one area, it tends in the visualization to kind of hide some of the finer grain. So Bill ran another analysis. Next slide, please. And here, trying to determine the areas of highest bike usage while accounting for variations in zone size and the inability to calibrate the index values. So we were able to normalize the StreetLight index values by the zone area and then show that in terms of the total percentage of trips, and then divide that by the area of that zone, and that gave us an overall percentage that we could look at. And as you see, we get a lot better fine-grained information throughout the county. It's not just concentrated in the university area anymore. Much better information. And so one of those, the data is only as useful as your creativity in understanding it and displaying it. But really, I think this is a great way to highlight that there are a lot of trips that are being made by bicycle throughout the entire county.